$17. That was the price of a man's life, or at least Arthur Finch's life for the next 6 months. The worn paper bills felt thin and weightless in his pocket, a stark contrast to the heavy silence of the Montana Territory that pressed in from all sides. He stood at a crossroads marked by nothing more than a stooped, sun-bleached signpost, the dust of his long walk from the last town coating his worn boots and the frayed cuffs of his trousers. He had answered an advertisement in an eastern paper, a simple, hopeful block of text that felt like a lifeline after his family's farm had turned to dust. It promised a partnership, a stake in a homestead for any man willing to put his back into the land. The name on the correspondence was J. Lee, a name that suggested a sensible, perhaps lonely, homesteader. Arthur had imagined a widow, sturdy and plain, or maybe a spinster who had inherited a claim she couldn't work alone. He was prepared for hardship, for calloused hands and the ache of honest labor. He was not prepared for the figure that emerged from the pines as the afternoon sun began to bleed toward the mountains. She moved with a liquid grace that was at odds with the rugged landscape, dressed head to toe in black trousers, black shirt, and a black flat-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. A Colt peacemaker rested on her hip, the holster tied down to her thigh, a detail that spoke of function, not decoration. She was Chinese, her features sharp and intelligent, her eyes missing the deference he was accustomed to seeing. They were dark, watchful, and they sized him up in a single sweeping glance that made him feel like a horse being inspected at auction. "You're the man from the paper," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was low and clear, without any discernible accent. Arthur swallowed, his throat suddenly as dry as the road. "Arthur Finch, for the partnership." She gave a short, humorless nod. "I am Jade." She didn't offer a hand. She didn't smile. "The last 3 men who came for this partnership lasted less than a week. The one before that made it 3 days before he ran." A cold knot formed in Arthur's stomach. This wasn't the arrangement he had envisioned. This woman was not a farmer. She was a fighter. The way she stood, balanced on the balls of her feet, told him that much. The homestead, he was beginning to suspect, was not a place of peaceful toil. "The work is hard," he offered, his voice sounding weak even to his own ears. "The work is the easy part," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "It's the neighbors that are hard. They don't take kindly to me. They'll take even less kindly to a man working for me." The isolation of the crossroads suddenly felt less like peace and more like a threat. This was the Montana Territory in 1882, a place where the law was a day's hard ride away and a person standing was everything. A Chinese woman living alone, holding a land claim, armed like a gunfighter. She wasn't just an outsider, she was a challenge to the natural order of things as men around here saw it. And he, by standing here, was about to become part of that challenge. Jade reached into a leather pouch on her belt and pulled out a small stack of bills, identical to the ones in his own pocket. "Here's $17, she said, holding it out. "You can take it, turn around, and be back in Redemption Gulch by nightfall. Tell them the job wasn't what you expected. No one will think less of you for it. In fact," she added, a flicker of something like bitter humor in her eyes, "they'll probably think more of you." He looked at the money in her hand, then at the vast, indifferent wilderness around them. He had nowhere to go. Redemption Gulch was just another town where he had no prospects, no name, and no money. Going back was no different from giving up. He had spent his last dime getting here, chasing the ghost of a promise in a newspaper. His hands, though soft from weeks of travel, knew the feel of an axe handle and a plow. He was a farmer, and a farmer's currency was stubbornness. He looked past her, toward the trail that led into the deep woods. He couldn't see a cabin or a field, just the dense stand of pine in the looming shadow of the mountains. It was a place a person could disappear, or a place a person could make a stand. "A deal's a deal," Arthur said, his voice quiet but firm. He pushed her hand with the money gently away. "I stay." For the first time, Jade's expression changed. The hard mask of indifference cracked for just a second, revealing a flicker of surprise. She studied his face, searching for something, a lie, a weakness, a hidden motive. Whatever she was looking for, she either found it or decided it didn't matter. She pulled her hand back and tucked the money away. "The cabin is 2 miles in," she said, turning without another word. "Keep up." Arthur watched her go for a moment, a solitary figure in black against the immense green and brown of the frontier. Then, taking a deep breath, he picked up his worn satchel and followed her into the woods, away from the world he knew. The cabin was less a home and more a small fortress. It was tucked into a narrow valley built of thick, neatly notched logs with a defensible position against a rock face. There were no glass windows, only heavy wooden shutters that could be barred from the inside. A small, cleared plot of land held a struggling vegetable garden, and a crude corral housed 2 sturdy horses and a single milk cow. A creek, clear and cold, ran along the edge of the clearing, the only source of water. It was a place built for survival, not comfort. The days settled into a rhythm of hard, shared labor. Arthur cleared stones from a new plot of land, his back screaming in protest after the long period of inactivity. He repaired the corral fence, reinforced the roof of the small barn, and tended to the animals. Jade worked alongside him, her movements economical and strong. She could swing an axe as well as he could, her small frame belying a surprising strength. They spoke little, the sounds of their work filling the silence between them. He learned about her through her actions. She was meticulous, wasting nothing. She was a creature of habit, checking the perimeter of the clearing every morning and every evening, her rifle always within arm's reach. He saw the proof of her skill one afternoon when a hawk circled too close to their single chicken. Before he could even move for a rock, there was a crack from the porch. The hawk tumbled from the sky, a single, clean shot through its wing. Jade lowered her rifle, her expression unchanged. She was not just a woman with a gun. She was an expert. He began to understand why the other men had run. This was a life lived on a knife's edge, and Jade was the only thing holding the balance. Then, one morning, the easy sound of the creek was gone. Arthur went to fetch water and found the buckets came up only half full, the water sluggish and muddy. He walked upstream and, a quarter mile from the cabin, found the cause. A crude dam of logs and rocks had been thrown across the narrow channel, diverting the flow away from their property. It was deliberate, meant to choke them out. Without the creek, the garden would wither, the animals would thirst, and their small homestead would die. "It's Thorne," Jade said, her voice flat when he told her. She stood on the porch, staring toward the hills. "Bartholomew Thorne. His ranch borders this claim. He wants the water." "Can he just take it?" Arthur asked. "He believes he can take whatever he wants," she replied. "He has money, men, and the ear of everyone in Redemption Gulch." Arthur felt a familiar sense of helplessness. This was the same story as back home, just with bigger sky. A powerful man deciding the world belonged to him. But here there was no town council, no judge to appeal to. There was just Thorne, and there was them. "I'll go talk to him," Arthur said. It was a foolish idea, and he knew it. He was a nobody, a hired hand, but doing nothing felt worse. Jade looked at him, her dark eyes assessing him again. "He won't listen to reason." "I'm not a fighter," Arthur said quietly, "but I can talk. Let me try." She gave a slow nod. "Take the bay horse, but stay on the main trail. And Arthur," she added as he was about to leave, Do not let him see you are afraid. The ride to the Thorne Ranch was a study in contrasts. He left the wild, untamed woods of Jade's claim and entered a world of order and possession. Miles of sturdy fencing enclosed vast pastures where hundreds of cattle grazed. The main house was a sprawling timber building, 2 stories high, with a porch that wrapped all the way around. It was a statement of wealth and power. Bartholomew Thorne was on the porch, a large man with a florid face and eyes the color of a pale winter sky. He was flanked by 2 hard-faced men who wore their guns with the casual ease of long practice. Thorne smiled when Arthur approached, a wide, predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. "Well now, what have we here?" Thorne said, his voice a rich baritone. "The Chinawoman's new pet. You've lasted longer than the others, I'll give you that." Arthur dismounted, his hands feeling clumsy as he tethered the horse. "My name is Arthur Finch. I've come about the creek. You've dammed it." Thorne chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Son, that creek originates on my property. What I do with my water is my business. It's a simple matter of property rights. Surely you understand that." "The claim she holds has riparian rights," Arthur said, the legal term feeling foreign and flimsy in his mouth. "The water has to be allowed to flow." "The claim she holds," Thorne said, his voice losing its pleasant edge, "is a mistake, an unnatural thing. That piece of land and the water that runs through it should belong to this ranch. It will. It's only a matter of time." He took a step forward, his bulk seeming to swallow the light. "My advice to you is to take your pay and move on. There's nothing for you up there but trouble. She's not worth dying for." One of Thorne's men stepped forward, grabbing the reins of Arthur's horse. "Time for you to go." Arthur stood his ground. He was terrified, a tremor starting in his hands that he couldn't stop. But he remembered Jade's words. He looked Thorne directly in the eye. "Tear down the dam." Thorne's smile vanished completely. "You have a lot of sand for a hired boy." He nodded to his man. "Show him the gate." The man moved toward Arthur, his hand dropping to his pistol. Arthur braced himself for the blow, for the humiliation. And then it came. Not a punch, but a sound. A sharp, echoing crack that was impossibly loud and impossibly close. High on a tree branch 100 yards away, a metal bucket used for collecting pine sap exploded, spinning wildly on its hook. Everyone froze. Thorne and his men stared at the swinging bucket, then scanned the distant ridge. There, silhouetted against the sky, was a figure. Even from this distance, Arthur knew it was Jade, her rifle resting steady in her hands. She hadn't aimed at them. She didn't need to. The shot was a message, delivered with surgical precision. It said, "I am here. I am watching. And I do not miss." Thorne stared at the ridge for a long moment, a new expression on his face. Not fear, but a grudging, dangerous respect. He looked back at Arthur, his pale eyes narrowed. "You tell her this isn't over." He waved a dismissive hand. "Let him go." Arthur swung himself onto the bay's back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned the horse and rode away, not daring to look back until he was well clear of the ranch. He didn't see Jade on the ridge on his way back, but he knew she was there, watching over him. When he got back to the cabin, he found her on the porch, methodically cleaning her rifle, her face as unreadable as ever. "He said it wasn't over," Arthur said, his voice hoarse. "It never is," she replied, not looking up from her work. "But you did well. You didn't run." She paused, then looked up at him. "That was the easy part." Arthur frowned. "What's the hard part?" Her gaze was direct, holding a depth of weariness that seemed ancient. "Thorne doesn't just want the water," she said. "He wants this land. He thinks the only thing standing in his way is me." Arthur was beginning to realize that a blocked creek was the least of their troubles. The real fight hadn't even begun. That evening, a fragile peace settled over the small homestead. The dam was still in place, but Thorne's immediate threat had been pushed back. The silence on the porch felt different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the shared quiet of allies who had faced a common enemy. Arthur sat on the steps, mending a leather harness, the familiar work calming his frayed nerves. Jade stood by the railing, a dark shape against the deepening twilight, watching the tree line. "Why here?" Arthur asked, his voice low. "Of all the places in this territory, why fight for this patch of dirt so hard?" Jade was silent for a long time, so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "My father bought this claim. He worked on the railroad, laying track across the mountains. For 10 years he saved every cent they didn't take from him. He sent money home, but he kept enough for himself. He wanted a piece of this country, something that was his, something no one could take away." She turned from the railing, her face partially illuminated by the light spilling from the cabin door. "He filed the claim under the Homestead Act, filled out the paperwork, paid the fees, got the official seal. He was so proud. He was one of the only Chinese men in the territory to manage it. He built this cabin with his own hands." Arthur stopped his work, listening intently. This wasn't just land. It was a legacy. "Thorne wanted it then, too," she continued, her voice hardening. "He offered my father money, then threatened him. My father was a proud man. He refused. A year ago, Thorne and 2 of his men rode up here. They said they wanted to talk about the water. There was a dispute. The marshal from Redemption Gulch called it a tragic accident. My father was dead." The words hung in the cool night air, heavy and cold. Arthur finally understood. Jade wasn't an outlaw. She was a survivor, a daughter defending the only thing her father had left her. She was holding on to this land not for its value in dollars, but for its value in blood and sacrifice. "He thought I would be easy to scare off," Jade said, a bitter edge to her voice. "A lone woman, a Chinese woman. He figured I'd run back to whatever city I came from. He doesn't understand. I have nowhere else to go. This is my home." She walked into the cabin and returned with a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him. It was a land deed. The paper softened and creased along the folds from countless readings. The script was careful, the official seal of the Montana Territory pressed into the bottom corner. The name on the deed was Lee June. It was her father's legacy, a tangible piece of proof in a world that ran on force and assumption. Arthur handed it back to her reverently. He now knew what he was truly fighting for. Their quiet victory was short-lived. Thorne, having failed at direct intimidation, changed his tactics. A few days later, a rider from a neighboring homestead, a nervous man who wouldn't meet Arthur's eye, delivered a copy of a notice that had been posted all over Redemption Gulch. It was signed by Thorne and a dozen other concerned citizens. It declared Jade an illegal squatter, a dangerous element who threatened the peace of the community. It was a thinly veiled lie, leveraging the town's prejudice to turn her into a pariah and create a justification for what was to come. They were painting her as the aggressor, the outlaw, to give their land grab the veneer of justice. The notice turned their isolation into a siege. They were now officially enemies of the town. No one would sell them supplies. No one would offer them aid. They were utterly alone. That night, Jade laid out the last of her cash on the simple wooden table between them. It wasn't much, maybe $50. "You have to go, Arthur," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "This is my fight, not yours. With this notice out, any man who stands with me is as good as dead. Take the money. Take the brown horse. Ride east. Don't stop until you're out of this territory." He looked at the money, then at the determined set of her jaw. She was offering him an escape, a chance at the quiet life he thought he wanted. He could walk away and no one would blame him. He could be just another man who hadn't lasted the week. But when he looked at her, he didn't see an outlaw or a stranger. He saw a woman of immense courage, standing alone against a world determined to crush her. He saw the worn deed in his mind's eye, the testament of a father's dream. Leaving now would be a betrayal of everything he was beginning to believe in. He slowly pushed the money back across the table. "I told you when I arrived," he said, his voice steady. "A deal's a deal." He met her gaze, and for the first time, he did not feel shy or out of place. "I'm not leaving you to face them alone." A flicker of something raw and vulnerable crossed her face before she could hide it. It was the look of someone who had been alone for so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone choose to stand beside her. She gave a single sharp nod, accepting his decision. The choice was made. He had cost himself any chance of a safe, anonymous life. He was no longer just a hired hand. He was her partner for whatever came next. The waiting was the worst part. They knew Thorne would come. It was only a matter of when. They spent 2 days fortifying the cabin. Arthur, using the practical ingenuity of a farmer, turned the clearing into a series of alarms and obstacles. He dug a shallow trench along the most likely path of approach and filled it with dry branches. He stretched thin wires between trees, connecting them to stacks of old tin cans that would rattle and clang at the slightest touch. It wasn't a military defense, but it would prevent a surprise attack. It would give them time. Jade spent her time cleaning her weapons, her movements calm and deliberate. She checked her rifle, her pistol, and a second pistol Arthur hadn't seen before. She said little, but a grim resolve had settled over her. This was the final stand for her father's legacy. On the 3rd day, just after dawn, one of the tin can alarms rattled in the distance. They were coming. Arthur's stomach clenched, but he took his position by one of the shuttered windows, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He held an old shotgun, loaded but heavy and unfamiliar in his hands. Through a crack in the shutter, he saw them. Thorne was at the front, on a big chestnut horse, followed by a dozen men from town. They were not a formal posse. They were a mob, their faces a mixture of greed, prejudice, and self-righteous anger. They rode into the clearing, their confidence obvious. They expected to find a frightened woman, easily overwhelmed. They stopped just short of the trench. "Jade!" Thorne's voice boomed across the clearing. "You've been declared a trespasser. Come out now and we'll see you get a fair ride out of this territory. Resist, and we can't be responsible for what happens." The cabin remained silent. The mob grew restless. 2 men dismounted and started forward. They hit the tripwire and a cascade of cans clattered loudly, the noise jarring in the morning quiet. It was a simple trick, but it unnerved them. They hesitated. Then, the first shot came from the cabin. It wasn't aimed at a man. It was aimed at the rifle held by the man closest to the porch. The bullet struck the wooden stock, splintering it and tearing the weapon from his grasp. The man cried out in shock, staring at his stinging, empty hands. A second shot rang out, and the hat flew from another man's head. Panic began to ripple through the group. This wasn't the easy eviction they had been promised. This was something else. Jade was firing with a speed and accuracy that was terrifying. She was disarming them, humiliating them, showing them she could have killed them at any moment. She was demonstrating her power through restraint, a language of violence they understood perfectly. The mob's courage began to crumble. Men started backing away, their bluster evaporating in the face of such impossible skill. Only Thorne remained, his face purple with rage. He drew his own pistol, aiming for the window where the shots had originated. In that moment, Arthur did the one thing they wouldn't expect. He unbarred the door and stepped out onto the porch. Unarmed, his hands held open at his sides. He walked to the edge of the steps and stood there, a plain, unassuming man, placing himself between the gun and the woman inside. "This land is hers," Arthur said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. It wasn't a shout, but a clear, firm statement of fact. "The law says so." He held up the deed, the worn paper a fragile shield against the threat of violence. Thorne stared at him, momentarily confused by this quiet act of defiance. He raised his pistol, his fury focused on this new obstacle. And that was when another sound joined the tense standoff. The steady, rhythmic beat of approaching horses, fast and purposeful. A group of 4 riders crested the hill, led by a man wearing the unmistakable badge of a U.S. Marshal. He was a tall, weathered man with a grim expression, and he took in the scene with a practiced eye. The armed mob, the defiant rancher, and the quiet man on the porch holding a piece of paper. Arthur had sent a telegraph 2 days earlier, a desperate plea for help addressed to the territorial capital, not knowing if it would ever be read. The marshal's arrival shattered the mob's remaining nerve. They were just men from town. Facing down a federal officer was another matter entirely. They began to melt away, holstering their weapons and avoiding the marshal's hard gaze. Soon, only Thorne was left, his pistol still in his hand, his authority gone. The marshal dismounted and walked over to Arthur, taking the deed. He examined it carefully, then looked at Thorne. "This looks legal and binding, Mr. Thorne. These men, however, look like a lynch mob. I suggest you go home before I decide to take a closer look at the accidental death of this property's original owner." Thorne's face went pale. He holstered his pistol, his arrogance finally broken. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away, a defeated man. The law, slow and distant, had finally arrived. By the following spring, the small homestead was transformed. The creek, freed from its dam the day the marshal left, flowed strong and clear. A small but healthy herd of 10 cattle, purchased with the money from a loan Arthur had secured against their future profits, grazed in a newly fenced pasture. The garden was double its original size, producing enough vegetables to feed them and a surplus to sell in Redemption Gulch. Arthur's hands were calloused and strong, his shoulders broader. He had found his place, not in owning land, but in building a life on it. The town's judgment had shifted. They didn't embrace Jade, but the open hostility was replaced by a wary, grudging respect. They called her the Guardian of the Creek, a name spoken with a mix of fear and admiration. When Arthur brought their produce to the general store, the owner met him at the door, not to block his entry, but to help him unload. The story of how the quiet farmer and the sharpshooting woman had faced down Bartholomew Thorne had become a piece of local lore. Their partnership was no longer a scandal. It was simply a fact. One cool evening, Arthur was on the porch, mending the same harness he had worked on the night Jade had told him her story. The leather was supple and familiar in his hands. The door opened and Jade stepped out, handing him a steaming cup of coffee. She no longer wore her gun belt around the cabin. The constant state of vigilance had eased, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. She sat on the steps beside him, watching the last light fade from the sky. In his breast pocket, Arthur could feel the crisp edge of a new piece of paper. It was the deed, refiled in the territorial office, bearing 2 names now, Jade Lee and Arthur Finch. The $17 he had arrived with felt like a lifetime ago. It had bought him more than 6 months of work. It had bought him a home. He looked at Jade, at the strength and serenity in her profile, and a simple truth settled in his heart. In a world that so often mistakes noise for strength and aggression for power, sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is quietly refuse to leave. It was a hard way to earn a life, but standing your ground, side by side with someone you trusted, was the only way to build one that was true.